Old stones aren't worth anything, my son said. But inside the lighthouse I found a safe. Inside were oil company shares worth over $50 million. I never expected such betrayal from my own children. They drove up at low tide, 3 shiny cars nosing over the ruts like skittish colts. From my kitchen window I watched their tires spit pebbles, a little stone storm against the old grass. The lighthouse stood behind me the way it always does. Back straight, paint flaking, smelling faintly of salt and lamp oil that soaked into everything here. I had a pot of chowder cooling on the back burner and a loaf of brown bread wrapped in a towel. I put the towel tighter around it, as if bread could be scandalized. My son Michael climbed out first, jacket shoulders too square, the way city men wear armor they can take off at night. Behind him came Elise, neat as a pin, her scarf bright enough to scare Herring. The third car coughed up 2 men I didn't know and a short woman with a hard little purse. They all shaded their eyes and looked at my lighthouse the way people look at a patient who's stayed too long on life support. "Ma," Michael said when he reached the porch. He kissed my cheek without touching me. "You got a minute?" "You and half the county," I said, opening the door. "Wipe your feet. Sand takes root in the floorboards." They stepped in with their city shoes and their perfume that couldn't quite drown out the clam flats. The woman with the purse introduced herself as Joanne something, and the 2 men with her were in development, which sounded to me like half-baked cookies. I set out mugs, poured coffee, and slid the bread knife across the table. The knife had my husband's initials scratched in the handle. One of the men raised his eyebrows at it, as if I kept muskets under the sink. Elise didn't sit. She drifted to the window. "You know this land could be beautiful," she said, as if I were blind. "A proper view, open space. A boardwalk maybe. People could enjoy it." "They already do," I said. "Fishermen know to steer by that lamp. In fog you can hear the horn from 3 miles out." "We'd put a tasteful light," Joanne said, smiling with her teeth and not her eyes. "Nothing intrusive." Michael cleared his throat. He unfolded a folder as carefully as you'd lay out a shirt for ironing. "Ma, we've talked about this. The lighthouse isn't." He stopped, pushed his hand through his hair. He was 5 years old again, cowlick kicking up. Then his jaw set. "Old stones are worth nothing. The land is. You're sitting on something that could make all of us comfortable. You wouldn't have to worry about winters, roofs, any of it." "I'm not worried," I said, slicing bread. The crust cracked in a way that made the room feel honest. "I keep good shingles." Elise came to the table, palms up, a truce she'd used since she was little and wanted to go to the dance. "Mom, it's quick money. No fuss, no litigation, no waiting. They handle the demolition. We sign today, they wire the deposit, and you keep the cottage we'll build for you inland. 2 bedrooms, bright, not drafty. Think of your knees, sweetheart." My knees did ache like old companions who grumble and still carry your bags. I poured chowder into bowls and pushed one toward Joanne, who shook her head and kept smiling. "It's not just about us," Michael said. "The town wants this. Jobs, taxes, new life out here. The town also wants to remember itself," I said, setting a bowl in front of Elise, who sat to be polite. "There's a fog bell under those stairs. Built in '58. Children come to hear it on field trips. They put their hands on the iron and laugh when it hums." Joanne laid papers on the table as if setting a tablecloth. "Mrs. Gray, the structures are non-compliant. There are safety issues. We'd file for immediate permits. We'll offer relocation assistance and a fair market valuation well above assessed value. Initial offer here if you'll just..." She tapped where the line waited for my name. "I can read," I said. "And I can sign. And I can also say no." Michael's mouth thinned. "Don't be stubborn." "Stubborn kept this place lit during the blizzard of '77, I said, more sharply than I meant. I breathed, counted. Let the seas hush through the open window have its say. Have your coffee. Then you can take your papers and go. We ate in a silence held together by spoons. The developers tried to make small talk with each other. A nervous shuffle of words. Elise sipped and stared at the lighthouse door through the window. The door I had painted red myself with a brush that shed bristles like a cat at springtime. Michael didn't touch his chowder. He kept his folder close as if I might steal it. When they were done, I wiped the crumbs into my palm and shook them into the sink. Outside, the tide, patient as an old dog, nosed higher up the rocks. Gulls argued in the air. I stood and felt all the eyes in the room hook into me like burrs. "You're making a mistake," Michael said. "Maybe," I said. "But it'll be my mistake." Elise reached for my hand, squeezed, and for a second I felt the girl who used to braid her hair in my lap. "Think about it tonight," she said softly. "Call us in the morning. Please." "I'll think about it," I said, because that's polite and because I do think even when I say I won't. I walked them to the door. Joan tucked her papers away with a practice flick. The men nodded. Michael hugged me with his shoulders again. Elise kissed my cheek and breathed in, as if she wanted to keep the smell of this kitchen, old wood and bay leaves and salt. They drove away. Gravel settled. The chowder pot sighed. I stood there a long minute, then turned to the lighthouse as if it had called my name. Inside the tower the air changed cooler. A damp whisper that lives in stone. My steps echoed as I climbed to the second landing. The walls, white once, now a patient gray, felt different under my palm. Not softer. Not wetter. Just different. There was a seam I didn't remember, thin as a pencil line, running along the mortar between two stones the height of my hip. I pressed with the heel of my hand, and something gave the slightest yield, as if the wall were not all wall. I leaned in until the paint flaked against my blouse. Behind the seam came a hollow note when I rapped. Not the deep bell of solid rock, but a boxier sound, like tapping a bread tin cooling on the counter. I stepped back and looked at the curvature, the way the light from the small window slid along it. The hair on my arms rose, though the air was still. "Old stones are worth nothing," I whispered to the room, and the room, I swear, whispered back in its dust-dry way. I laid my hand flat again, found that line with my fingertips, and smiled, though no one was there to see. The storm rolled in just past midnight, the kind that makes the sea pound its fists against the rocks and sends the gulls screaming inland. I lit the old kerosene lamp when the power flickered out, and its glow threw shadows over the curved walls of the lighthouse. Those walls had stood for 150 years, through tempests and wars, but that night I felt them groan like tired bones. I was climbing the narrow stairwell, carrying a wool blanket to my bed, when I heard it, a sharp crack like a rifle shot. At first I thought it was just the glass of a window giving way to the wind, but the sound came from inside the stone. The wall trembled beneath my palm. Dust sifted down in a thin stream, settling on the steps. I fetched a lantern and returned to the base of the tower. There, by the southern wall, the plaster had split open in a jagged line, exposing rough-hewn stones beneath. Salt and damp had worked at the mortar for years, and now the storm had forced its secret out. I bent low, brushing the grit away with my fingers. Behind one of the larger blocks, something glimmered dully in the lamplight, a seam of iron. My heart skipped. I pulled at it, but the stone did not budge. I tapped with the poker from the fireplace, and the hollow sound that rang back told me it was no ordinary stone. It took nearly an hour, with the sea howling through the broken shutter and my hands raw from scraping, but at last the block shifted. What I found behind it made me sit back hard on the cold floor. A hatch. Round, thick, and made of blackened metal. It was set flush into the masonry, the edges sealed with some kind of lead. A handle sat at the center, rusted but unbroken. My lamp flame danced across its surface, and I could see faint markings scratched there. Initials maybe, long worn away by time. A safe. Hidden in the very bones of the lighthouse. I pressed my ear to it like a child at a seashell, listening for some hint of what it might hold. Nothing but silence and the echo of the sea. My fingers trembled as I traced the handle, though I knew it would not open without a key, or a skilled hand. I sat back on my heels and let the wind batter the tower around me. My children had only yesterday stood in this very room, waving contracts under my nose, telling me the lighthouse was nothing but dead stone. But dead stone did not hide secrets. Dead stone did not keep its silence for a century, and then reveal a treasure in the middle of a storm. I leaned closer and whispered into the crack of the wall, as if speaking to my late husband, or perhaps the keepers who came before us. What did you leave me here? The rain hammered harder, driving me to cover the breach with an old oilcloth. I didn't want the water to rust the lock further, not until I knew what lay inside. My mind whirled with possibilities. Papers? Gold? Perhaps just the logbooks of some long-forgotten keeper. But whatever it was mine. Mine, not the developers. And certainly not my children's, who thought only of tearing down what they never bothered to understand. By dawn the storm had passed, leaving the air smelling of seaweed and iron. I made myself strong coffee and stared at the wall while the lighthouse warmed with morning light. The safe was still there, waiting, patient as stone. I knew I could not open it myself. My hands were strong enough for bread dough and garden shears, but not for iron. So later that morning I walked the mile into the village. I said nothing to the neighbors who nodded as I passed, only pulled my shawl tighter against the wind. At the little locksmith shop near the dock, I asked for a man to come by, quietly. He was to arrive the next evening. I told him the lock was old, very old, and that he must bring delicate tools. He did not ask what it was, and I was glad. Some secrets are too fragile to carry on the open air. When I returned to the lighthouse, I set my chair opposite the hidden hatch and listened to the sea breathing through the cracks. The safe seemed to throb in the wall, a secret heart beating just for me. My children thought the place was nothing but stone and salt, but I knew better. The lighthouse had spoken, and I would listen. The locksmith came on a Wednesday, carrying a satchel that clicked and jingled with the promise of secrets. His name was Paul, gray hair combed straight back, hands too clean for a man who claimed to work with iron. He smelled faintly of tobacco and engine oil, like the ferry captains who used to pass through. I led him to the base of the tower without saying much. He ran his hand along the exposed masonry, whistling low. "Well now," he said. "That's no window latch. Haven't seen one of these in years. Can you open it?" I asked. My voice came out sharper than I intended. He gave me a look, half amusement, half calculation. "Everything opens eventually." He unpacked his tools and set to work. I watched as thin steel picks danced in the keyhole, as he tapped and twisted with the patience of a priest saying Mass. The air smelled of oil and salt, and each metallic scrape seemed loud enough to wake the dead. After nearly an hour there was a sound, soft but certain. A click. My heart jolted. "There we are," Paul said, leaning back on his heels. "Open as a clam at low tide." He stepped aside so I could pull the hatch. The hinges groaned like an old throat clearing itself, and the door swung inward to reveal a safe set deep into the wall. Thick steel, dusted with rust but intact. Its own dial gleamed faintly in the lamplight. "You'll need more than me for that," Paul said. "Combination lock. Solid. Could be days before it gives." I touched the cold face of it, wondering who had set the numbers, whose hand last turned that dial. "I'll manage," I said. He studied me longer than I liked, then packed up his tools. "Funny thing," he said, snapping his satchel shut. "Your son and I know each other. Michael. He played ball with my nephew back in school. Haven't seen him in years, but I hear he's done well. Big city man now." The words sat heavy in the room. I managed a thin smile. "Yes. He visits. Good boy, that one. Paul went on, as though testing the shape of my silence. Must worry about you out here rattling around alone. A place like this can play tricks on an old mind. I said nothing. Just walked him to the door and watched him disappear down the path toward the village, his satchel clinking with each step. When I returned to the safe, I laid both hands on its cold surface. My secret was no longer mine alone. Paul's eyes had seen too much, and I did not trust him to keep his mouth shut. 3 days later Michael came. He did not bring his children nor Elise. He came alone, which was unusual enough to set my nerves jangling before he'd even spoken. He strolled the kitchen with restless hands, picking at the bread basket, glancing toward the tower. "How's the place holding up after the storm?" he asked too casually. "Well enough." I poured coffee and set a cup before him, though he barely touched it. His eyes kept straying to the lighthouse door. "You've been keeping busy in there?" I felt the question like a fishhook. "Always something to mend," I said lightly. "The storm opened a crack in the wall. I patched it." He nodded, but his jaw worked tight. "Funny. Paul mentioned he stopped by. Said you had him look at something. Said it was unusual." I steadied my hands on the cup. "Locks need tending to." Michael leaned back, folding his arms. "You'd tell me if there was something else, wouldn't you? Something worth knowing?" His tone had changed, no longer casual but sharp, prying. I met his gaze, and for the first time in years I felt like I was staring at a stranger wearing my son's face. "There's nothing for you here but memories," I said. "And those are mine to keep." He left not long after, but the air of suspicion lingered like smoke. The following day Elise arrived with a basket of fruit, smiling too brightly. She wandered the tower steps under the pretense of admiring the stonework, asking small questions that carried too much weight. "What do you keep in these old walls, Mom? Anything important?" Her fingers trailed along the seam where plaster still dusted the floor. I wanted to slap her hand away like a child touching a stove. That night I sat alone by the safe, listening to the waves slap the rocks below. The metal face caught the lamplight, stubborn and silent. My children were circling, hungry as gulls. Paul had fed them just enough to make them curious. I pressed my forehead against the cool iron and whispered, "You've slept here for decades. You'll stay quiet for me a little longer, won't you?" But deep inside I knew, secrets are like storms. They don't stay bottled forever. The lighthouse never truly sleeps. Even on calm nights you hear it breathing, wood creaking, iron humming, waves gnawing the rocks below. I sat by the safe for days, running my fingertips over its steel face, as though stroking an animal that might bite. My children had begun circling me like shadows, and I knew their patience wouldn't last. The truth inside that safe had to be mine before anyone else laid a hand on it. I spent 2 evenings trying the dial myself, guessing birthdays, anniversaries, even the year my husband's ship first docked in this harbor. Nothing. The tumblers mocked me, clattering faintly but never falling into place. I could almost hear the men who had built it laughing at my foolishness. At last, I swallowed my pride and called Paul again. When he came, I told him as little as possible, standing close, watching every flick of his wrist. He muttered numbers under his breath, listening with an ear pressed to the steel. An hour passed. My lantern burned low. Then click. The door swung open with a long groan. Dust billowed like breath released after half a century. Inside were bundles wrapped in oilcloth, stacked neatly as loaves in a baker's cupboard. My hand shook as I drew the top bundle out and unwrapped it on the table. Papers. Not the yellow diaries I half expected, but crisp documents with the letterhead of a company I knew only vaguely, PetroGulf. The dates stamped across the top were from the 1960s. At first I thought they were just old certificates, nothing but relics of a business long dissolved. But the more I read, the more the words carved themselves into me. Common stock, fully transferable, shareholder of record. My breath caught. These weren't scraps. These were shares, hundreds of them. The name of the lighthouse's original keeper, Samuel Gray, was written in careful ink across the first page. My grandfather. I sat stunned, the paper trembling in my hands. Paul leaned over my shoulder, too curious for my liking. Well, would you look at that? Could be worth something, eh? I snapped the folder shut. Thank you, Paul. That'll be all. He hesitated, his eyes lingering too long on the bundle. I forced a smile and pressed a few bills into his palm. Too many, but enough to push him out the door. He left with a half bow, but I knew better than to believe the matter closed. When the door latched behind him, I unwrapped the rest of the bundles. Page after page of shares, certificates sealed with golden crests, each more unbelievable than the last. I read the company's name again, PetroGulf. It struck a bell now. They had grown into one of the largest oil firms on the coast, owners of refineries and shipping ports. If these shares still carried weight, they weren't scraps at all. They were a fortune. I sat there until the lamp guttered out, staring at the neat stacks of paper. For years my children had called the lighthouse a burden, a pile of stone and rust worth nothing but the land it stood on. All the while the walls had been guarding something far heavier than bricks, something that could change everything. By morning the gulls were screeching over the tide pools, and I was still at the table, the shares spread before me like cards in a dangerous game. My hands smoothed over the paper, trying to steady themselves. I could almost hear my son's voice. Old stones are worth nothing. If only he knew. If only he guessed how wrong he had been. But Paul had seen. And Paul talked. I had no doubt his tongue was loose by now, wagging to Michael, perhaps Elise too. Their questions, their prowling looks, it all made sense. They weren't just curious about the lighthouse anymore. They suspected it held something. I gathered the papers into a tin box and slid it beneath the floorboards under my bed. Then I sat on the quilt edge and listened to the sea roar against the cliffs. For the first time in years, the lighthouse did not feel like a burden. It felt like a fortress. But I also knew this. A fortress draws siege. My children would come again. And this time they would not be asking. They came on a Sunday unannounced, as though this place were already theirs. Michael's car crunched up the gravel drive first, Elise's sedan right behind. Neither brought their children this time. That alone told me it wasn't a family visit, it was business. I had just pulled the chowder pot off the stove when the knock rattled the door. Too firm, too eager. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened it. Michael stood there, folder under his arm. Elise carried a smile stretched tight as wire. "Mom," Michael said, brushing past me before I could answer. "We need to talk." The kitchen shrank with their presence. Elise placed herself near the window, as if the sea view belonged to her already. Michael spread papers on the table, his eyes avoiding mine. "What's all this?" I asked, lowering myself slowly into the chair opposite him. "Simple," he said briskly. "A repair declaration. Just something to confirm you're allowing structural adjustments. The developers require it before they can move forward." Developers. I let the word hang. He cleared his throat. "Potential developers. It's preliminary, that's all. Standard procedure." Elise chimed in, soft and syrupy. "It'll protect you, Mom. Make sure the liability isn't yours if something happens to the building. You just sign here, and the rest will be handled." She slid the pen toward me. The papers lay neat, official-looking, but too thick for a mere repair form. My eyes, though tired, still knew the shape of deceit. I scanned the first page. Legal jargon, yes, but there it was, buried in the middle, renunciation of ownership. I set the pen down. "This isn't repairs," I said quietly. "This is surrender." Michael's jaw tightened. "You're misreading it." "No." My voice steadied. "I know what my name looks like when it's meant to vanish." The room turned brittle. Elise stepped closer, her smile gone. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Think of what you're holding on to. A ruin. Cold stone and rust. You deserve better than this. I pushed the papers back. Better than truth? Better than history? No, thank you. Michael's voice cracked sharp now. You're being impossible. He slammed his palm on the table. You don't understand the stakes here. This is money, real money, and you're clinging to a pile of rocks out of spite. I understand perfectly, I said, standing. And I said no. His hand darted toward the tin box on the counter, the one where I'd foolishly left the safe keys after moving them earlier that morning. My breath froze. He wasn't even pretending anymore. I lunged quicker than my knees should have allowed, snatching the box just as his fingers grazed it. The keys inside rattled like bones. For a moment we stood inches apart, his face red with anger, mine pale with fury. Give them to me, he hissed. They are mine, I said. My voice shook, but it held. Elise moved to block the doorway, her eyes sharp now, no sweetness left. Mom, don't do this. We're trying to help you. You'll thank us when it's over. Help looks different than theft. I backed toward the stairs, clutching the box. Michael stepped forward, but I slammed the corridor door shut between us and twisted the lock. Their fists pounded against the wood, the voices rising, echoing up the stairwell. Mom, you're not thinking straight. You can't keep us out forever. I pressed my back against the cool stone wall, heart hammering like the sea against the rocks outside. Their shouting filled the air, but up here in the tower, the sound thinned, swallowed by stone and salt. I climbed higher, keys clutched to my chest. On the landing beneath the lantern room, I sank against the railing, listening to them rage below. My children, my blood, banging like strangers trying to break down a stranger's door. When at last the pounding stopped, silence poured through the lighthouse like a tide. I sat there long after, the box warm in my hands, knowing something had shifted forever. This was no longer a quarrel about land. It was a siege. And I was the last keeper. After that Sunday, the lighthouse grew quieter, though not in peace. Silence from my children was worse than their shouting. It felt like the pause between waves, the breath before the sea hurls itself at the rocks again. I knew they were scheming. The papers proved it. The attempt to take the keys proved it. I needed someone who wasn't bound to me by blood. Someone whose loyalty came from something older, sturdier. That's when I thought of Henry. Henry Callahan had been my husband Arthur's closest friend at sea. They'd hauled nets together back when men trusted the weather more than engines, when a storm could kill you just as quick as hunger. Henry had gray in his beard now, a limp in his stride, but his eyes were still as sharp as gulls. He lived 2 villages over in a shack with nets piled high as walls, mending them with those weather-bitten hands of his. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but when I phoned and asked if he could spare a morning, his answer was immediate. For you, Maggie? Always. He came 2 days later, his old truck coughing up the path. The smell of tarred rope and brine followed him into my kitchen. He tipped his cap, squinted at the walls. Place still stands. Sea tried its best, eh? We sat with coffee and I told him everything, the storm, the cracked wall, the safe, the shares. His weathered face barely changed until I slid one certificate across the table. He studied the paper, lips moving as he read the letterhead. PetroGulf, he murmured. Well, I'll be damned. This company. Maggie, they've grown into giants. They own the oil port in Harborview now. Export half the coast's crude. These aren't scraps. These are worth more than gold. I leaned closer. You're certain? As certain as I am of the tide. He tapped the certificate. Each share could fetch thousands. Hundreds of them? You're sitting on tens of millions, Maggie. The word struck me like a wave. Millions. Enough to rebuild the lighthouse 10 times over. Enough to keep me warm through every winter I had left, and enough to draw sharks. Henry must have seen the fear on my face, because he laid his calloused hand over mine. Listen. Your children, they smell the money already, don't they? They tried to trick me into signing it away, I whispered. Brought papers. Called it repairs. Then they tried to take the keys. His jaw tightened. They'll stop at nothing now. I nodded, feeling tears sting but refusing to let them fall. I can't lose this place, Henry. Arthur and I, this lighthouse is all we built together. It's all I have left that feels like home. He squeezed my hand. Then we make sure it stays yours. First thing, we secure those papers. Get them appraised, registered in your name, protected. I know a man in town works with estates. Discreet. He owes me favors. We'll start there. I exhaled, the weight of loneliness lifting just slightly. And if they come again? Henry's eyes hardened, the way they must have when storms rose on the horizon. Then you won't be standing alone at the door. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the danger was gone, it wasn't, but because I no longer carried it by myself. The safe still waited in the wall, the shares hidden beneath the floorboards. Yet knowing Henry would stand beside me gave the stones of the lighthouse a stronger spine. Before bed, I climbed to the lantern room. The sea stretched black and endless, but the moon laid a silver path across it. I thought of Arthur, thought of the men who'd tended this light before me. For the first time since the storm cracked the wall, I whispered not in fear but in promise. They won't take you, I said aloud, palm against the glass. Not while I breathe. Below, the waves boomed their answer. And for once I believed them. Henry was true to his word. The very next morning, we drove into Harborview in his coughing old truck. He knew a lawyer there, a wiry man named Dalton who owed him from some fishing quarrel settled years ago. Dalton looked over the PetroGulf shares with a frown that melted quickly into awe. These are real, he said almost reverently. Authentic certificates, still valid. If recorded properly, their value is extraordinary. I asked him not to say the number aloud. Numbers once spoken tend to echo too loud. He nodded, promised to begin the filings, and urged me to keep the shares hidden until everything was secured. That was the first move. But the counterstrike wasn't long in coming. 2 weeks later, I received a thick envelope, hand-delivered by a man in a suit who didn't bother to smile. Inside were papers full of legal words, stamped with the seal of a construction company whose name I didn't recognize. The gist was clear enough. A challenge to my ownership, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage property of such significance. My children had put their signatures on affidavits. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter in my lap, staring at the sentences until they blurred. Incapable. That word cut worse than any knife. My own children, who I had raised with my hands and my heart, were now declaring me unsound. When Henry came by that evening, he found me still sitting there. He read the letter and swore under his breath. This isn't just them anymore. The developers are behind it. They want the land, Maggie, and your children have signed you away to get their slice. He was right. Days later, Elise called, her voice too sweet, as if she were coaxing a child. Mom, don't worry about those papers. It's just formalities. Once the sale goes through, you'll be comfortable. You won't have to fight the sea or the cold anymore. Let us handle it. Comfort, I said. Is that what you call selling your mother's bones to strangers? She didn't answer. Just sighed long and weary before ending the call. Word spread fast in the village. Neighbors who once waved from their porches now eyed me with pity, whispering about the lawsuit, about the greedy developers, about my children's betrayal. Some muttered I should just take the money and move inland. Others looked at me with a quiet respect, as though I were the last stone resisting the tide. But the pressure grew. Another letter came. This one a preliminary sales contract already signed by Michael and Elise. My name was absent, yet the ink was dry, their betrayal sealed. The developers were moving forward as though I didn't exist at all. That night I couldn't sit still. I paced the lighthouse corridors, lantern in hand, listening to the sea batter the rocks. The stones felt alive under my palms, as though the lighthouse itself knew it was under siege. I thought of Arthur, of the keepers before us, of the oil company shares tucked safely under the floorboards. All of it, our history, our future, reduced to signatures on paper by children too blind with greed to see the truth. When Henry came by again, he found me on the lantern landing, staring out at the Black Sea. "They've signed a contract," I told him. "Without me." He spat over the railing, anger thick in his voice. "Then it's time you fought them properly. Court Maggie. Let a judge see who you really are. They want to call you incapable? Prove them wrong." The idea scared me, but it also lit something inside. I had spent years keeping the lamp burning for sailors who might never even know my name. Now I would burn it for myself. For the truth. "They want a fight," I said, gripping the railing. "Then they'll have one." Henry clapped my shoulder. "That's the keeper I remember." The waves thundered below, echoing his words. And for the first time I no longer felt like a woman standing alone against her own blood. I felt like the keeper of a fortress worth defending. Courtrooms smell different from the sea. No salt, no tar, no damp stone, just paper, polish, and stale coffee. I sat there on the oak bench in my best wool coat, the same one I wore to Arthur's funeral, and felt as though I had carried the lighthouse on my back into that room. Michael and Elise sat across from me with their lawyers, sleek men in darker suits, hair slicked like wet gulls. My children wouldn't meet my eye. When they did, it was only to shake their heads, pity painted across their faces as though I were a confused old woman lost in her own storm. The judge, a tired man with glasses low on his nose, called us to order. The lawyers started first, sharp voices, smooth words. They spoke of my age, my isolation, the eccentricities of someone who had lived too long by the sea. They said I clung to a ruin out of whimsy. They said I had lost my judgment. I sat silent, hands folded tight in my lap. Let them speak, I thought. Let the tide rush out before the wave returns. When it was my turn, I stood with Henry at my side. His presence gave me spine. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I told the judge about the storm, the cracked wall, the safe in the stone. I laid the tin box gently on the table and slid out copies of the PetroGulf shares. The golden crest shone under the courtroom lights. "These are not whims," I said, letting the papers fan across the wood. "These are my inheritance, hidden here by my grandfather when this lighthouse was still young. They have value, real measurable value. The lighthouse is not a burden. It is a legacy." The courtroom, so full of chatter before, went still. Even the judge leaned closer to peer at the seals. Michael's lawyer tried to laugh it off. "Old certificates, Your Honor. Souvenirs." But Dalton, the estate lawyer Henry had brought, stepped forward with a folder of his own. "We've already begun authentication. PetroGulf has acknowledged preliminary serial numbers. These are no souvenirs. These are millions in equity." I saw Elise's face pale at that, her lips parting but no words coming. Michael shifted in his chair, eyes darting between me and the judge as though he'd miscalculated the tide. The judge cleared his throat. "Given the claims of value, I'll appoint an independent appraisal." He set his glasses down with finality. "Until then, this court will not recognize any sale of the lighthouse or the surrounding land. Motion to proceed with development is suspended." The gavel cracked, sharp as a gunshot. For me, it sounded like the first peal of a fog bell in the night. Afterward, in the hallway, Michael finally looked at me. His eyes burned with something harsher than anger. It was desperation. "You can't keep this up, Mom. You're not strong enough." I met his gaze. I've been keeping lamps burning against storms since before you could tie your shoes. Don't mistake age for weakness. Elise reached for his arm, tugging him away, her face tight as a drawn net. They left without another word, their lawyers whispering after them like crows. Henry exhaled beside me. You showed them, Maggie. You showed them good. I nodded, though my legs trembled beneath me. It's not over. They'll come harder now. Then we'll stand harder, he said, steady as stone. That evening, back at the lighthouse, I climbed all the way to the lantern room. The sea stretched black and endless, but the horizon glowed faintly with dusk. I lit the lamp, not for ships this time but for myself. Its golden beam swept across the waves, across the village, even across the far hills where my children drove away in silence. This is my light, I whispered, and it will stay burning. The lamp answered in its hum, the sea in its roar. For the first time in months, I felt not only like a keeper but like a fighter. The appraisal took weeks. Weeks of silence from my children, broken only by the occasional sharp letter from their lawyers, letters I left unopened in a stack on the sideboard. Weeks of sea air, of gull cries, of waiting for footsteps I feared might come at night. I lived as I always had, mending nets, baking bread, polishing brass, but each small act was sharpened by the knowledge that millions lay hidden beneath my floorboards. The lighthouse walls seemed to lean closer around me, as if keeping their secrets safe. At last the day came. The court summoned us back. Henry drove me to town in his truck, steady as ever, while the tin box with the copies of the shares sat wrapped in my shawl on my lap. I carried it like one carries a child, close, careful, unshaken. The courtroom felt heavier this time, charged with expectation. Michael and Elise sat at their table, both pale, both thinner than I remembered. Greed wears people down faster than sea storms. Their lawyers whispered frantically to them, but their eyes darted toward me as though I were the one who had betrayed them. The judge entered, spectacles glinting. Papers rustled. Everyone rose, then sat. He cleared his throat. The independent appraisal has been completed, he said. His voice carried the weight of finality, like the foghorn cutting through a gale. The PetroGulf certificates are authentic. Their current market value exceeds $50 million. Gasps rippled through the room. My breath caught, but I kept my face steady. 50 million. I had known it would be large, but hearing the number aloud was like hearing the ocean roar after years of calm. The judge went on. As such, the lighthouse is not merely a relic, but a property of significant financial and historical importance. Any claim of incompetence by the respondent, he nodded toward me, is unfounded. Mrs. Gray has demonstrated full capacity to manage her affairs. The petition to sell the property is dismissed. His gavel struck sharp as thunder. Just like that, the siege broke. Michael surged to his feet, his face flushed crimson. This is madness, he shouted. She's manipulating. Sit down, Elise hissed, tugging at his sleeve. But her own face betrayed her, pale as sea foam, eyes wide with panic. The lawyers tried to recover, muttering about appeals, about procedure. But their words were lost in the commotion. The developers' representatives, who had filled a whole bench behind my children, rose in a clatter of suits and briefcases. They looked like rats deserting a sinking ship, already backing out of deals that had turned rotten. I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, calm as the tide. Inside, though, I was shaking with something that wasn't fear anymore. It was victory, raw and burning in my chest. Henry leaned close and whispered, "They can't touch you now, Maggie. Not a damn finger." Michael finally sank back into his chair, glaring at me with a fury I had never seen, not even in his most rebellious youth. Elise hid her face in her hands. For once, I felt no urge to comfort them. I had spent my life soothing their hurts, softening their blows. But this wound they had cut into themselves. After court adjourned, reporters clustered at the steps outside, shouting questions about the lighthouse fortune, about betrayal, about legacy. I said nothing, just held Henry's arm and walked past them, my chin high. The sea wind hit my face like a blessing when we stepped outside. Back at the lighthouse, I carried the tin box upstairs. I laid the shares out on the lantern room table, their golden crests gleaming under the beam. 50 million. Enough to buy comfort, power, even forgiveness if I wanted it. But I didn't want comfort. I wanted purpose. That night I sat with the window open, listening to the waves crash. My children had shown me their faces, hungry, cold, willing to cut me out of my own life. But the lighthouse had shown me something else, endurance. It had kept its secret for half a century, waiting for me. I thought of Arthur, of my grandfather, of the keepers who had come before. None of them built this place for quick money or easy gain. They built it to last, to guide, to protect. That was the legacy the shares had been hidden to preserve, not to be squandered by greedy hands, but to keep the light burning. I smoothed my palm over the papers, feeling the ridges of the embossed seals. Tomorrow I would meet with Dalton again. Tomorrow I would decide what to do with the fortune. But tonight, I allowed myself one moment of stillness. The sea hissed and boomed against the rocks. The lamp swept its golden arm across the water. And I whispered, softly but firmly, "They thought I was nothing but an old woman in a ruin. Now they know the truth." The lighthouse answered in its hum, steady and eternal. And I felt for the first time in a long while utterly unshakable. When the court battle ended, the developers vanished like gulls after scraps are gone. Their calls stopped, their letters ceased. Their shadows no longer lingered on my porch. My children, well, silence from them was heavier than any storm, but I carried it. Silence can be a wall or it can be a shield, and I chose the latter. With the shares secured, Dalton urged me to sell, to diversify, to live out my days in ease. But I didn't want ease. Ease is soft and soft things crumble. I wanted permanence. So I made my choice. The papers went back into the tin box, but not under the floorboards this time. I opened an account, had the shares transferred, and drew up plans. Not for myself. Not for Michael or Elise. For the lighthouse. The tower had stood too long with peeling paint and creaking timbers. The spiral stairs wobbled in places. The lantern room's glass was clouded with salt scars. I hired men who understood restoration, not demolition. Craftsmen who respected stone, iron, and history. They came with scaffolding, with brushes and chisels, with hands that worked slow and careful. Neighbors wandered up the bluff to watch. Some shook their heads at the expense. Others smiled, remembering when the lamp guided their father's home. The children, wide-eyed, pressed their noses to the fence as the men scraped, sanded, painted, until the lighthouse shone white again against the blue horizon. I oversaw it all from my kitchen window, or from a chair set near the work. The smell of fresh lime mortar mixed with the sea air. The sound of hammers echoed like a heartbeat. Piece by piece, the old tower came back to life. When the last pane of glass was polished, and the lantern gleamed like a jewel in the sun, I held a gathering. No courtrooms, no contracts, just neighbors, fishermen, schoolchildren, anyone who wished to see. I laid out tables with bread and chowder, pies cooling on the sills, coffee poured into mismatched mugs. We climbed the spiral stairs together, slow but steady, until the lantern room brimmed with bodies and breath. Children gasped at the view. Mothers wiped their eyes. Old sailors gripped the railing with reverence. I stood by the great lamp, my hand on the cool brass. "This light has stood for 150 years, I said, my voice carrying over the crowd. It was nearly lost, nearly torn down for profit, but it was never just stone, never just steel. It was memory, it was warning, it was hope. And it still is." I told them then what I planned. The lighthouse would be a museum, a place where children could learn about storms, ships, and the people who kept the lights burning. A place to remember the lives built and lost at sea. A place not for developers, not for greed, but for legacy. There was applause, quiet at first, then stronger. The children cheered. Someone began to sing an old sea hymn. And for the first time in years, I felt the air inside the lighthouse warm with joy instead of suspicion. That night, after everyone left, I lit the lamp myself. The beam cut across the waves, steady and strong, sweeping the horizon just as it had in Arthur's time, just as it had in my grandfather's. I sat alone in the lantern room, the sea black beneath me, the stars sharp above. My children had tried to strip this from me. They had called me incapable, stubborn, foolish. But the light burned on. Not because of them, but in spite of them. And perhaps someday when they drive past this coast, they will see it shining and remember what they tried to destroy. I whispered into the glass. You will outlast us all. The lighthouse hummed in reply, its beams slicing the dark, a promise made not just to me, but to everyone who would ever look up and see it. A promise that some things cannot be bought, and some legacies cannot be sold. The sea roared, the lamp glowed, and the lighthouse, my lighthouse, shone again over the endless deep. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.